The West Rand shutdown demonstration has moved to the communities of Bekkersdal and Munsieville. They have joined calls to rid the country of illegal miners and undocumented foreign nationals. They are accusing the illegal miners of committing crimes, including rape and robberies in the area. 29 illegal miners were detained yesterday in Kagiso. These protests follow the gang rape of 8 women on Thursday last week. They were all part of a production crew shooting a music video near a mine dump in Krugersdorp. According to police, the suspects are believed to be illegal miners. So all of these incidents, the mass rapes that we reported there, the shooting sprees, the murders read together, paint our country as a place of fear and repeat trauma. How do we begin to make sense of the insensible? Come to peace with this war on our society. Let's bring in Malose Langa, who is a senior associate researcher from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Good evening to you, Malose, and thank you very much. Perspective is probably the way we do it. What is your perspective on all these acts of violence, some historic and perennial?
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this conversation. Yeah, I mean, it's quite worrying, and it is quite evident that things are spiraling out of control. But it's a situation that some of us who have been researching the issue of violence over the last 20 to 30 years, we are not surprised that we have reached this point where now everything has become quite spectacle. The violence has become quite public, and in fact, we used to say violence breeds trauma, and trauma breeds violence. And for me, it feels like as if the chickens have come home to sort of roast. And when you see some of these scenes, especially let's talk about where some of the suspects are made to be naked, and there've been reports of mob justice, and we cannot divorce this from our history. And people in the 80s will tell you about the necklacing. So we've been saying this for quite some time, that the unresolved trauma will reenact itself in the current sort of moment.
Yeah. And
of course, this is linked with many other complexities where communities feel they are under siege from, I guess, criminals, and they're not getting the protection that they expect, from the police.
Right. Malose, I just want to, hold on, I just want to, talk a little bit about what you have already laid out. And it is quite a disturbing context that you set, because what you're telling us is, as traumatic and as frequent as these acts that we are witnessing in society may seem to us, you as a research agency obviously see this in its fuller depth, and there's a lot in this picture that we are missing. Why do you think what needs to happen to make sure that we see the fuller picture of who we are as a society with respect to violence?
I mean, first of all, we need to condemn that violence cannot solve no violence, and I think that's what communities need to sort of accept, and it is during this height time where we need to exercise some restraint, that going out carrying guns, carrying weapons, carrying sticks is not going to be a solution. In fact, this is going to create more problems, because we may have instances where some people sort of retaliate, and we have seen, I mean, with some of the cases about mass shootings, to say, are these organized or not organized? Are these revenge killings or not? But I think the key message that we need to sort of communicate is that violence cannot be resolved through violent means. There is no evidence in the world. I mean, the cases of mob justice are not new in this country. We have had them in different communities. But believe me, if you go to those communities and check if whether the rate of crime has decreased as a result of a mob justice that was once meted out, we have no evidence of that. And I think that's what we need to sort of communicate, that we need to find peaceful means to resolve the rapes that are happening in our communities, the violent acts that are taking place in our communities. But also we need to try and understand, to say, why are all these incidents, sort of happening? And once we get to that point, because now I think everyone is just frustrated and frustrated and frustrated. And of course, when you're frustrated, you want to find a scapegoat. Who do we blame? Because now we are seeing anti foreign sentiments taking place, where it is it is the Zamazamas, and I'm not saying the Zamazamas are not to be blamed, but then squarely saying the problem is with the Zamazamas. We may miss to understand the problem. But I guess the key message in brief is that we cannot resolve violence through violent means.
When you talk about the research showing that even in areas where people have meted out vigilante, or what we term mob justice in South Africa, it hasn't had, this consequential effect of reducing crime or incidents like the ones that led to that kind of punishment, in inverted commas, in the first place. It is talking about, to the second point that you mentioned, people feeling powerless to be able to do something. And some of that goes directly back to governance. It goes back to the institutions of agency that citizens should have access to, simply not being there in the gap. Is that both the curse but also the opportunity for how we begin to turn this around, Malose?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, through each crisis, crisis also can be an opportunity for something quite positive, to come out of it. But I think here we also need to accept sentiments that are being expressed by community members, to say there's an increasing level of crime, where people live in so much fear, where people get robbed on a daily basis, where there's a sense that the police are not doing much. But having said this, at the end of the day, we need to go back to the drawing board in identifying how did we get to the point where we are right now. And we need to accept that some of the issues that community members are raising are not new. And we need to avoid the PR exercises. The PR exercises where incidents happen, and then suddenly we see our political leaders, going to those communities. Because in fact, this is what our research, sort of confirm, where community members are saying the only way to be heard, it is when you take onto the street, you block the roads, you ban public properties, you take the law onto your own hands, and that's the only time where you get listened. And of course, in some of these communities, people will tell you to say, we've gone to Kagiso police station, we've gone to Alexandra police station, we've complained about this and we've complained about this, and nothing was ever sort of not done. And of course it becomes very, very wrong, because it is only when communities take to the street when we sort of respond. And I don't think we need to wait for things to get out of control for then leaders to run to those communities. I think we need to be more proactive. But here, the other issue, it's who are the perpetrators? Who are the people that are perpetrating this violence? Violence in terms of organizing the protest, violence in terms of raping women, violence in terms of robbing people, and then we need to also ask that question to say, who are these people?
Certainly a national conversation is necessary, Malose. Thank you very much for taking us through what has been complex territory, but there's no doubt that what you mentioned in the first part of our interview, this pathology of violence, from a historical perspective, certainly has been under-addressed in contemporary South Africa. Malose Langa is a senior associate researcher from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Appreciate your time tonight.